They say the quietest nights often hold the strangest beginnings. This is not a story of battles or noise, but of dogs, the most familiar of companions, who once carried a secret vast enough to reshape the world. And tonight, I want to share it with you softly, like a lullaby whispered at the edge of sleep. You don't need to stay awake for every word. Just let the rhythm carry you. Know this first. We truly care for you, and we are so grateful you are here, resting with us. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now take a breath, sip your coffee or tea, and let's begin. They say the strangest things do not arrive with thunder or fanfare. They come instead, like a hush that lingers in the air, like a still breath you didn't realize you were holding. And on that quiet night, beneath a heavy, watchful moon, Morty felt something shift, something he could not name, but would remember long after. Tay. House was ordinary. The neighborhood was still. The yellow glow of the street lamp painted soft shadows across the lawn, and the crickets hummed their endless lullaby. Morty sat by the window of his small, cluttered room, his elbow on the sill, his chin resting on his hand. He was tired, though not in the way that sleep could fix. It was the kind of tired that clung to the edges of his mind after too many strange days with Rick. He had been dragged through portals, nearly eaten by things that didn't have names, and had argued with teachers who didn't believe his excuses. But this night was different. In the backyard, Snuffles sat in the grass. His small body looked ordinary at first, a dog's frame, a wagless tail curled neatly around his side. But there was nothing ordinary in his posture. He was still, utterly still, with his head tilted upward. He was staring at the moon. Morty blinked. Dogs looked at things, sure. They barked at cars, they chased cats, they stared at their food bowls. But there was something unsettling, and strangely beautiful, about the way Snuffles gazed at the sky. It wasn't a glance, it wasn't curiosity. It was a kind of devotion, as if the moon had called his name. "Rick," Morty whispered without moving his eyes from the window. You should look at this." Rick was at his desk, surrounded by wires, tools, and the faint smell of solder. He didn't lift his head. His hands kept working, his muttering carried on. "Dogs stare at things, Morty. They're dumb animals. Don't romanticize it." Morty frowned. Rick's voice had that sharp edge of dismissal, the one he always used when he didn't want Morty asking questions. But beneath it, just for a heartbeat, Morty heard hesitation. Rick had looked up just briefly, just enough to catch the glow of fur under moonlight, and then he'd turned away too quickly, as though the sight had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Morty pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Outside, Snuffles hadn't moved. His eyes gleamed faintly, reflecting the silver of the moon, but it wasn't a simple reflection. The light lingered there, clung to him, as though the moon itself had bent a little closer to rest in his gaze. The night deepened. The neighborhood houses dimmed one by one, their windows darkening, their televisions clicking off. The world outside grew softer, gentler. Morty stayed awake longer than he meant to, watching. Sometimes he thought he saw the faintest shimmer ripple through the grass near Snuffles, as if the air itself were bending around him. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, unsure if it was a trick of tiredness. But the feeling wasn't a trick. It was calm, steady, protective. Morty felt safer, in a way he couldn't explain, just knowing Snuffles was out there, unmoving, guarding something beyond the yard. He shifted into bed, pulling the blanket up. Yet his gaze returned again and again to the window. Snuffles did not waver. Snuffles did not break his vigil. And in that stillness, Morty thought he heard something. Not a bark, not a sound that would wake the neighborhood. It was lighter than a whisper, softer than breath, words that weren't words brushing against the edge of thought. "Rest now, little one." Morty's eyelids grew heavy. He let them close, even as his heart tugged him to stay awake, to witness what might come next. But the night was patient, and his body was not. Sleep crept in like a tide, gentle and unstoppable. The last thing he saw was Snuffles, still gazing, at the moon, paw prints pressed into the damp earth beneath him. Paw prints that looked, just for a moment, like a constellation written on the ground instead of the sky. And somewhere, in the back of Morty's mind, a quiet thought lingered. This was not just a dog, not just a pet. This was the beginning of something. Something vast, something hidden, something tender. The night of silent paw prints had only begun. Morning crept in slowly, as if it too had been watching through the night. The curtains glowed faintly with sunlight, soft gold bleeding into the dimness of Morty's room. Birds stirred in hesitant calls, as though they were unsure if the world outside had changed while they slept. Morty rubbed his eyes, the weight of dreams still clinging to him, like dew on grass. His first thought wasn't of school, or of Rick's experiments, or even of breakfast. It was Snuffles. He stumbled toward the window, his hair tangled, his shirt twisted from uneasy sleep. The yard looked ordinary again. No shimmer, no glow, no strange stillness, just the damp earth, the fence in the distance, and Snuffles lying curled up in the grass. For a moment Morty wondered if he had only imagined it all. Maybe it was just the way moonlight played tricks. Maybe he had been so tired he'd turned his own longing into illusions. But no, something in his chest told him otherwise. There was a residue, a quiet imprint, as if the night had pressed a secret into him while he slept. He padded into the garage where Rick was hunched over his workbench, eyes half-lidded, hands restless. Wires, glass tubes, and the faint hiss of a welding torch filled the air with their mechanical lullaby. Rick didn't look up. He rarely did when Morty entered. Rick," Morty began softly. "Last night, I think Snuffles was acting weird. Like he was staring at the moon. I mean, not just staring, he was, I don't know, watching it like it was talking to him or something." Rick gave a sharp laugh, the kind that sounded more like a cough. He set down his tool, wiping grease from his hands onto a stained rag. "Morty, dogs don't watch the moon. They're, instinctual, Morty. Their brains are tuned to meat and smells and scratching themselves, okay? If your dog looked at the moon, it's because a squirrel probably ran across the roof and he got confused." But Morty noticed the pause. He always noticed Rick's pauses. Rick's words came fast, too fast, like they were meant to drown out the possibility that he was wrong, and, in the pause, brief but real, Morty thought he saw something else, unease. "You didn't see it though, Rick," Morty pressed, his voice wobbling but insistent. "It wasn't normal. He didn't even move, not once. And I thought I heard something like whispers." Rick finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his face worn. He gave a smirk, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Whispers? Morty, from a dog, that's not whispers. That's your brain processing, hormones or puberty or whatever you've got going on in there. Dogs don't whisper, Morty. They bark, they whine, they sniff butts. That's the whole package." But Morty didn't back down. Something about last night had given him a quiet kind of courage. It didn't feel fake, Rick. It felt real. Rick studied him for a long moment. His smirk stayed, but it softened at the edges. He leaned back in his chair, picking up his flask, swirling the liquid inside as if it held the answers. "Morty, listen. The universe is full of weird stuff, okay? I've seen entire dimensions where the clouds whisper lullabies and the rivers sing in harmonies. Compared to that, a dog staring at the moon is nothing. It's boring." And yet, when he said it, his gaze flicked toward the window, just for a second. Just enough to betray something Morty couldn't name. The garage filled with silence again, broken only by the hum of machinery. Morty sat on a stool staring at the floor, wishing Rick would take him seriously. Finally, Rick sighed, the kind of sigh that carried more weight than words. He reached across the bench, pushing a small, half-finished gadget aside. "You want the truth, Morty. The truth is, and dogs do have something people ignore. Loyalty, Morty, pure dumb loyalty. They'll sit by you when you're sick, wag their tails when you're a screw-up, lick your face when you're at your worst. You know what that does to a brain? It tricks you into thinking they're deep." But even as he spoke, there was a softness in his tone, rare, fleeting. A softness Morty recognized as the closest thing Rick had to honesty. "So you're saying it's not real?" Morty asked. Rick smirked again, lifting the flask. "I'm saying it doesn't matter. Real, fake, who cares? If it makes you feel something, Morty, maybe that's enough. Just don't go writing poetry about it, okay? Morty almost smiled. Almost. He wanted to argue, but he also knew Rick's way of hiding his truths inside jokes. Rick didn't want to admit it, but he'd seen it too. Morty could tell. That night, Morty lay in bed again, staring out the same window. The moon was bright, casting its silver blanket across the lawn. And there was Snuffles again, sitting in stillness, his eyes catching the light, watching, waiting. Morty whispered into the quiet, though no one answered. Rick can laugh if he wants, but I know there's something more. In the garage, Rick poured himself another drink, muttering under his breath. His smirk lingered, but in the lonely glow of his workspace, it curved differently, less like dismissal, more like wonder he couldn't bear to admit. A skeptical smile, yes, but behind it a truth he wasn't ready to face. Sleep, that fragile bridge between waking and forgetting, carried Morty gently into its arms that night. The room was quiet except for the hum of crickets outside and the faint creak of wood settling into the dark. His blanket was pulled up to his chin, his thoughts still heavy with Rick's words, with Snuffles' silent gaze, with the mystery that refused to let him rest fully. At first, the dream was ordinary. He was in school, fumbling with books that slipped from his hands, students laughing softly in the way dreams exaggerate. Then, as if the air itself had changed, the scene blurred. Walls melted into mist, desks faded into long, rippling grass. A meadow unfolded, vast and endless, glowing faintly, as if each blade of grass carried its own starlight. In the center of the meadow sat Snuffles. Not just Snuffles, hundreds of dogs, of every shape and size. They weren't running or barking, they weren't playing or chasing. They were seated in quiet circles, eyes closed as if listening to something Morty couldn't hear. Morty stepped closer, and his breath caught. For when the dogs exhaled, their breath wasn't just breath. It was words. Fragments at first. Soft, broken syllables drifting like lullabies through the glowing grass. Stay, rest, don't fear. The whispers braided together, forming patterns too gentle to frighten, too strange to ignore. Morty turned in circles, watching dogs tilt their heads, watching their mouths move without opening. The sound wasn't loud, not like voices in the waking world. It was quieter, like the hum of the earth itself. He sank to the grass, hugging, his knees listening. The words weren't perfect. They slipped and fractured like half-remembered songs, but the feeling behind them was undeniable. Comfort, safety, a deep promise that nothing in the world could disturb. One of the dogs padded forward. Snuffles. His eyes were warm, glowing faintly as though they carried moonlight within them. He didn't speak like a person. He didn't form human sentences. Yet Morty understood. The way you understand a melody without knowing the lyrics, the way you understand someone's silence more than their words. You're talking, Morty whispered, his dream voice trembling. Snuffles tilted his head, ears twitching. The grass stirred with a breeze that felt like agreement. Not talking. Listening. The whisper wasn't from Snuffles alone. It was from the field, the air, the very dream itself, and Morty realized he wasn't hearing with his ears. He was hearing with something deeper, something that had been waiting inside him all along. Other dogs drew nearer, their eyes reflecting faint stars. Their whispers overlapped, yet never tangled. Each carried a fragment, a piece of something. Larger. We remember you. You are not alone. We guard your rest. Morty felt a lump in his throat, though no sadness was in the words. It was the weight of being understood without asking. It was the relief of not needing to explain. The dream thickened around him, not darker but heavier, as though it wanted him to stay. He thought of Rick, skeptical, smirking, brushing everything aside. He thought of how Rick would dismiss this as neural noise, as wishful thinking. And yet Morty knew what he was feeling. No science could take away the comfort in these whispers. "Why me?" he asked softly, his hands sinking into the glowing grass. "Why are you talking to me?" The circle of dogs leaned closer, their shapes blending into one another, their breaths becoming one long, shimmering exhale. Because you listen. Morty closed his eyes, tears warm against his cheeks, though no sorrow filled him. He listened. The whispers grew softer, threading through his heartbeat, steady and patient. They spoke of rest, of kindness, of watching without needing to own. They spoke of loyalty, of love that didn't demand explanation. Snuffles pressed his head against Morty's knee. The warmth sank deeper than skin, reaching the very corners of Morty's tired soul. The meadow stretched endlessly, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like the safest place Morty had ever been. No laughter that cut too deep, no experiments gone wrong, no sharp edges of Rick's words, just whispers, just the sound of being held invisibly by something larger than himself, and then slowly the dream began to thin. The glowing grass faded into shadows, the whispers stretched into silence, and Morty's eyelids fluttered as the world of waking pulled him back. He opened his eyes to the soft light of morning. His pillow was damp from tears he hadn't realized had fallen. His chest felt light, as though something inside him had unclenched. Outside, Snuffles was lying in the yard again, paws tucked beneath him, his gaze steady on the window. Morty pressed his forehead against the glass. He didn't need Rick to believe him. He didn't even need words. "Thanks," he whispered, voice barely audible. And though the dog didn't move, Morty swore he saw a flicker in his eyes, as if the dream wasn't entirely a dream after all. The morning after his dream, Morty moved through the house in a daze, like someone walking with music still echoing in their ears, long after it has stopped playing. The world seemed sharper yet softer all at once. Every shadow in the hallway, every sway of the curtains felt touched by something invisible. He carried the whispers with him, tucked quietly into his chest. Snuffles padded after him, paws clicking gently against the tile floor. He wasn't barking for food, or nudging for attention the way he sometimes did. Instead, he followed Morty closely, almost like a guardian shadow, his gaze unusually steady. Morty felt a warmth in it, a recognition, as though they both knew what had passed in the meadow of dreams. Rick was already in the garage, hunched over something that smelled faintly of burning metal and ozone. He glanced up, bleary-eyed, flask dangling loosely from his hand. "Morty, you look like you've seen a ghost or ate too much cheese before bed. You dreaming about algebra again?" Morty hesitated. He wanted to tell Rick about the whispers, about how the dog spoke in lullabies, how it wasn't frightening at all but safe, the safest he had ever felt. But he swallowed the words. Rick would scoff, maybe laugh. Some dreams were too tender to offer up to ridicule. So instead, Morty just shrugged. "I'm fine, just tired." That afternoon, the strange event happened. Morty had gone outside to sit in the yard, his notebook open though his pencil hardly moved. The sun leaned low, warm but not heavy, shadows stretching across the grass. Snuffles trotted into the middle of the yard, sniffing, circling, then pausing near a patch of dirt. He pawed lightly, ears pricking as if he had caught something buried beneath. "What you got there, buddy?" Morty asked, setting his notebook aside. Snuffles dug carefully, not with the frantic energy of a dog chasing a bone, but with deliberate motions measured and precise. Morty blinked, unsettled by how intentional it seemed. After a few moments, the dog uncovered something. It wasn't a bone or a toy or anything Morty expected. It was a collar, old but not decayed, silver though dulled by earth. Its surface shimmered faintly, pulsing in rhythm, not like a reflection, but like a heartbeat. Morty's breath caught. "Rick, come here." Rick shuffled out, muttering. Under his breath, when his eyes fell on the collar, he froze mid-step. The flask nearly slipped from his hand. "Well, that's not supposed to be here." His voice cracked slightly, as though he recognized it. Morty knelt, brushing soil away, lifting the collar into his hands. It was warm, almost too warm, like it had been lying under sunlight all day, though it had come from beneath the ground. Tiny lines ran across its surface, not words exactly, but shapes like constellations, stars linked by invisible threads. The moment Morty touched it, Snuffles sat straighter. His ears flicked, his eyes brightened, and for a brief second, Morty swore he saw understanding flash across the dog's face. Rick reached forward quickly, snatching the collar from Morty's hands. This is just junk, Morty. Old junk. Don't get sentimental. Probably some forgotten prototype from an alien yard sale. Nothing special. But Morty noticed Rick's grip tighten around it. He noticed how Rick turned it over again and again, eyes flicking across the glowing lines, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Then why is it glowing? Morty asked quietly. Rick forced a laugh, too sharp, too practiced. Everything glows if you look hard enough. Fireflies glow, fungus glows, heck, even you glow if I put you under the right scanner. Don't overthink it, Morty. But Morty could see it. Rick was rattled. Behind the mask of dismissal there was awe, maybe even fear. That night Morty lay awake in bed, the collar's faint light still dancing in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about it, how it had pulsed like a heartbeat, how Snuffles had unearthed it with such purpose, how Rick's eyes had betrayed something unspoken. When sleep finally claimed him, it carried him not into ordinary dreams but back to the glowing meadow. The dogs were there again, sitting in their circles, their breaths whispering lullabies. And in the center, raised gently above the grass, floated the collar, shining, steady, like a crown. The dogs didn't speak in words, but Morty felt it. The collar was not just an object, it was a key, a bridge, a promise. And as Snuffles padded toward him in the dream, Morty knew the world outside was shifting. Slowly, quietly. The collar was only the beginning. The collar sat on Rick's workbench, half buried under spare wires and shards of metal. But Morty couldn't stop thinking about it. The way it pulsed like a heartbeat, the way Snuffles had unearthed it with such care. Even hidden under junk, it seemed to breathe in the shadows, humming faintly like a secret too patient to rush. Rick kept himself busy, muttering about calibrations and resonance fields, tinkering with tools that sparked in brief flashes. But Morty knew better than to think Rick wasn't thinking about the collar. He had seen the way Rick's hands lingered on it, the way his eyes narrowed whenever the glow shifted. Rick's skeptical smile was gone now, replaced by a silence. Morty couldn't quite read. And Snuffles. Snuffles had changed. Not wildly, not suddenly, but in subtleties Morty couldn't ignore. He no longer barked for attention when Morty came home from school. He no longer scratched restlessly at the door. Instead, he sat quietly near Morty's chair, eyes soft, ears twitching not to noise but to something unseen. It was on a late afternoon, with shadows stretching long across the backyard, that Morty first noticed it. He was doing homework, or at least pretending to. His pencil tapped against the page, his thoughts drifting to the glowing meadow of dreams, to the lullabies hidden in whispers. He sighed, pressing his forehead into his hands. And then he heard it. Not out loud. Not the way he heard Rick's sharp muttering or the creak of the floorboards. It was softer, somewhere between thought and sound. Don't worry. Morty lifted his head sharply. Snuffles was sitting near the door, his gaze fixed on Morty, tail resting still. Did you just... Morty whispered. His voice cracked with disbelief. The dog tilted his head slightly, ears flicking. No bark, no growl, just that gaze, steady, as if waiting. Morty swallowed hard, closing his eyes. He breathed slowly, leaning into the strange stillness. And again it came. You are safe. Morty's chest tightened. It wasn't language the way Rick explained it, not syllables or phonetics. It was closer to how you feel warmth when the sun touches. Your face, or how you sense sadness in someone's silence. Words, but not words. He pressed a hand to his chest. I can hear you, he whispered, voice trembling. Snuffles padded closer, resting his head against Morty's knee. The weight was real, warm grounding, but beneath the touch was something deeper, a bond unspoken, a trust older than either of them could explain. That night, Morty told Rick, Rick didn't look up from his tools. You think you can hear him, Morty. That's different. Dogs don't. Ters send telepathic love notes. That's your tired little brain wiring up comfort because it can't handle chaos. Morty shook his head, his voice firm despite its softness. No, Rick. It's real. He told me I was safe. Rick scoffed, waving a hand. Safe, Morty? Nothing's safe. That's just wishful dreaming. The universe doesn't care if you're safe. But sure, yeah. Let the dog tuck you in at night. Real scientific. Morty didn't argue. He had learned something about Rick by now. Sometimes arguing only made him hide the truth deeper. Instead, Morty smiled faintly, remembering Snuffles' gaze, the warmth of his presence. Whether Rick believed it or not didn't matter. Morty knew over the next days the bond grew. Snuffles didn't chatter, didn't fill the air with constant words. But when Morty was anxious before class, when his stomach twisted at the thought of standing in front of everyone, Snuffles' quiet presence in his mind would murmur, "Breathe." When Morty came home heavy with the weight of Rick's sharp remarks, he'd hear "You are enough." And when Morty lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd ever matter in a universe so wide, Snuffles would whisper, "Rest, I am here." It was not loud, it was not dramatic. But it was steady, like a gentle hand on the shoulder, like the hush of a lullaby hummed just for him. Rick pretended not to notice. He buried himself in equations, in gadgets, in theories about neural resonance and harmonic wavelengths. But late, one night, Morty woke to the sound of quiet murmurs from the garage. He tiptoed down, peeking through the doorway. Rick was sitting there in the glow of a half-built machine, the collar resting in his hands. And though his face was turned away, Morty caught it, the faintest curve of a smile, not mocking, not skeptical, just tired and strangely tender. Morty didn't say anything, he didn't need to. Some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud. The collar shone faintly under the lamp, and Snuffles slept curled at Morty's feet. For the first time in a long while, Morty felt not just safe, but seen. He was learning to listen. Rick Sanchez had always been a man who claimed to know too much to ever be surprised. Wonder in his world was something for children and fools, not for scientists who had seen galaxies collapse and time itself bend like glass. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, when the garage smelled of metal and stale liquor, Morty often noticed Rick's hands linger too long on the strange silver collar. It pulsed faintly, as though keeping its own rhythm, a quiet heartbeat glowing with constellations etched into its surface. Rick never admitted to Morty that he didn't fully understand it. For Rick, admitting ignorance felt too close to admitting vulnerability. But when the tools were set aside and the equations scribbled across the walls refused to give him answers, Rick would find himself staring at that faint glow, caught between skepticism and awe. Morty sensed it, though Rick never said a word. The same man who brushed off the whispers of dogs, who dismissed the meadow of dreams as mere neural noise, was the same man who couldn't stop returning to the collar at 3 in the morning. One night, Morty padded into the garage, sleepy-eyed, rubbing his arms against the chill. He found Rick hunched over, shoulders sagging, flask half empty, the collar turning slowly in his hands. "Rick," Morty whispered. Rick startled, covering the motion with a sharp cough. "Go to bed, Morty. You got school tomorrow. Or detention, or whatever you usually screw up." Morty shuffled closer, ignoring the bite in his words. "You've been looking at it for hours," Rick smirked without lifting his gaze. "Yeah, well, maybe I just like shiny things. You ever think of that? Some people collect stamps, Morty. I collect glowing collars that make dogs look smarter than they should." But Morty caught it again, the pause, the subtle fracture in Rick's tone. "You believe there's something in it, don't you?" Morty asked softly. Rick finally glanced at him, eyes bloodshot but sharp. He opened his mouth to retort, to lace his words with sarcasm and indifference. But then he stopped. His gaze dropped back to the collar. "I've traveled dimensions where insects wrote poetry," Rick muttered, more to himself than to Morty. "I've watched suns burn backwards. I've dissected the brains of beings who thought in symphonies instead of words. And yet," he trailed off, shaking his head, "and yet a dog sits under the moon and suddenly I don't have an equation for it." Morty's heart tugged at the honesty in Rick's voice. It was rare, fleeting, like catching the glimmer of a fish just beneath dark water. "Maybe it's not something you solve," Morty said quietly. Maybe it's something you just listen to." Rick scoffed, though the sound was weaker than usual. "Spare me the bedtime fortune cookie wisdom, Morty. The universe doesn't whisper lullabies. It eats, it burns, it forgets. Dogs are just loyal little meatbags who trick you into thinking they matter more than they do." But even as he said it, his thumb brushed the etched lines of the collar with unusual gentleness. The glow reflected, in his eyes, softening the sharpness there. Morty didn't press further. He simply sat nearby, watching Rick wrestle with a truth he didn't want to admit. Later that night, Rick scrawled notes across a page, diagrams of neural frequencies and resonance pathways. But his mind kept circling back, not to science but to memory. He remembered being a boy once, though he rarely allowed himself to. He remembered a dog that used to curl beside him when the nights felt endless. He remembered how its steady breathing had been the only thing that made him feel less alone. He had buried those memories beneath galaxies, beneath alcohol, beneath arrogance. But now, staring at Snuffles watching over Morty, staring at the collar's gentle pulse, Rick felt them stirring again. He didn't tell Morty. He couldn't. But he envied the boy, envied how easily Morty trusted, how naturally he listened. Rick's mind was too restless, too fractured. Wonder, when it slipped through, only made him ache. The night stretched on, quiet and heavy. Rick leaned back in his chair, flask resting loosely in his hand, eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if searching for answers hidden in the rafters. "Maybe," he whispered to no one, "maybe there's more to loyalty than chemistry." Snuffles shifted in his sleep at Morty's feet, as if he had heard. The collar pulsed once, faintly, like a heartbeat syncing with Rick's own. Rick smirked, shaking his head at himself. Restless old fool." But even as he muttered, he couldn't quite shake the flicker of wonder blooming quietly in his chest. It began quietly, not with headlines, not with shouts in the streets, not with the loud machinery of change. Instead, it began in ways so soft that most people didn't notice at first. The world shifted one kindness at a time. A child who had dropped her toy in the park found a dog gently nudging it back toward her. An old man on his porch woke to discover a stray curled at his feet, keeping his ankles warm against the chill of dawn. Somewhere else, a boy too shy to speak in class felt a warm nose against his hand, the silent reminder that he wasn't invisible after all. Morty saw it most clearly. He started to notice how dogs lingered near people who were hurting. They sat beside kids who cried quietly into their sleeves, pressed their weight against tired workers walking home at night, and waited by bus stops, where loneliness often sat unspoken. "Rick," Morty whispered one evening, watching a group of dogs gather around a homeless man as he tried to sleep on a bench. The animals lay in a circle around him, like living blankets, their breathing steady, warm. The man smiled in his sleep, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who hadn't felt safe in years. Rick pretended not to be moved. Pack instinct. They conserve heat. Nothing mystical, Morty, just biology doing biology. But his voice cracked in the middle just slightly, enough for Morty to notice. It wasn't only comfort. The dog seemed to know when to guide, when to step into the flow of human life as though nudging it gently back on course. A blind woman stepping off the curb without realizing a car was coming. A dog barked once, sharp and loud, pulling her back just in time. A group of kids wandering too far into the woods. A pair of strays blocked their way until the children turned homeward. None of it was forced, none of it violent. It was as if the world itself was being softened by paws, pressing gently into the earth, leaving behind trails of trust. Morty couldn't help smiling at it all. "It's like they're taking care of us, Rick. Like they've always been waiting to." Rick snorted, staring hard at his flask as though it held more answers than the world outside. "Careful, Morty. That kind of thinking gets you." Writing bedtime stories instead of equations. But when Morty turned away, Rick's gaze lingered at the window. He watched as Snuffles padded across the lawn, sitting beside Summer while she studied on the porch. The dog leaned against her leg, and Summer, who usually had little patience for anything sentimental, sighed with relief, shoulders easing, as if she'd been waiting for that small act all day. Rick saw it everywhere, and though he would never say so, he felt the quiet tremor of awe. The strangest part was how natural it all seemed. Humanity did not question it. People didn't wake up in panic, wondering why the dogs had changed. They simply accepted it like accepting the rise of the moon, the passing of seasons. A subtle pact was forming, woven out of small kindnesses so gentle no one even thought to resist. At night, Morty dreamed of the meadow again. This time it wasn't empty. Children ran with the dogs, laughing softly, their footsteps making no sound in the glowing grass. Every laugh was an echo, every bark a lullaby. Morty awoke with his chest full of warmth, his heart convinced it was all real. The next morning, Morty told Rick about the dream. Rick rolled his eyes, but Morty noticed how he didn't interrupt this time. Instead, Rick sat quietly, as though the boy's words carried something even he was afraid to dismiss too quickly. "Small kindnesses, huh?" Rick muttered under his breath later, alone in the garage. "Yeah, that's how it starts. Not with fire, not with war, just warmth, sneaking in through the cracks." For the first time in a long while, Rick didn't reach for another drink. Instead, he let himself sit in silence, and for a fleeting moment even he felt safe. It happened on an evening so quiet that no one could have predicted it would be remembered forever. The sky was fading into indigo, stars preparing to bloom. Across the darkness, when Morty noticed the first cluster of dogs, they gathered at the edge of the park, tails still, bodies calm, not barking, not chasing, just waiting. At first, Morty thought it was coincidence, strays meeting in one place. But then more came. From alleys, from porches, from yards where children had just waved them goodbye, they padded across the streets with a purpose that was neither frantic nor rushed. It was as if they heard a music no one else could hear, rhythm pulling them softly together. Rick and Morty stood at a distance watching. Even Rick fell silent, flask forgotten in his hand. The dogs formed a wide circle in the field, moonlight catching the sheen of their fur. They did not fight for dominance, nor did they bark for attention. They simply sat side by side, a gathering, not of power but of presence. Families began to notice. People trickled into the park, whispering, pointing. No one dared approach too close, for fear of breaking whatever spell had drawn the animals there. Children clutched their parents' hands, their eyes wide with the wonder only a child can carry. Morty's heart beat fast, but it wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something gentler. "Rick," he whispered, They're organizing, like they're holding a meeting." Rick's mouth opened, a snarky remark ready, but he closed it again. His eyes flickered with something Morty rarely saw in him, respect. The circle grew until nearly every dog in the town sat beneath the moon. Some were mutts, some purebred, some limping, some old and grey. Yet in that space, none of it mattered. They were equals, their breaths rising and falling in unison, a quiet harmony that seemed to hum against the air. Then came the moment no one would ever forget. The dogs tilted their heads upward as one, gazing at the moon. Not a sound came from them, yet the silence itself felt like a language. Morty swore he could hear it, not words exactly, but a lullaby, a memory pressed against the edges of his mind. In the crowd, people grew still. A man who had been arguing with his wife moments before lowered his head, tears streaming quietly down his cheeks. A child who had been restless all day curled into her mother's arms, suddenly calm. The world around the circle seemed to exhale. Morty leaned closer to Rick. "Do you hear it?" Rick's jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the glowing formation of fur and moonlight. Finally he whispered, "Yeah, I hear it, Morty, not in my ears, but somewhere else." The gathering lasted only an hour, but for those who were there, time seemed to stretch. When the circle broke, the dogs dispersed as gently as they had come. They returned to porches, to streets, to strangers waiting in the dark. No one gave them commands, no one asked questions, and yet everyone seemed to know they had witnessed the beginning of something larger than themselves. That night, Morty dreamed of standing in a vast meadow under the stars, the same dogs encircling him, their eyes glowing softly like lanterns. He woke with a single word lingering on his lips: trust. Rick didn't speak of the gathering again, but Morty caught him once, days later, sketching in his notebook, drawing circles, constellations, patterns of connection. Rick looked up, caught, and slammed the book shut. "Don't read into it, Morty," he muttered. "It was just animals acting on instinct." But Morty saw the way Rick's hand trembled, the way his voice carried the edge of wonder he couldn't quite erase. The first gathering was never announced, never repeated exactly the same way. Yet somehow from that night forward, the world felt a little different, softer, safer, and though no one admitted it out loud, humanity had already started to follow. Morty had always thought of Snuffles as just his dog, small, white, loyal, sometimes needy, always waiting by his bed. But after the first gathering, something shifted between them. It wasn't sudden, not like a bolt of lightning. It was softer, slower, like the way dawn creeps into a room before you realize the night has passed. One afternoon, Morty sat in the backyard, homework forgotten in his lap. Snuffles padded over and lay down beside him. Morty absent-mindedly scratched, behind his ears, but then he noticed something unusual. Snuffles wasn't just sitting with him. He was matching him. Every time Morty sighed, Snuffles let out a low breath. When Morty leaned back, Snuffles rested his head against Morty's knee. It wasn't mimicry, it was attunement, the kind that happens only when two beings are listening, deeply to one another. Morty smiled faintly. "You get me, don't you, buddy?" Snuffles didn't answer, of course, but Morty felt it. The weight of the dog's body pressed gently against him, grounding him, anchoring him. He thought back to the meadow dreams, the glowing fields where he had run with countless dogs under starlight. The same warmth pulsed here in the real world, with Snuffles at his side. Later that evening, Morty tried something. He whispered to Snuffles, not commands, not questions, but feelings. He whispered how he worried about failing at school, how sometimes he felt invisible in his own family, how Rick's brilliance made him feel small but also inspired him. Snuffles blinked slowly, tilting his head, listening with the patience of someone who didn't need to understand every word, to understand the heart behind them. Morty's chest loosened in a way it never had when talking to people. He realized that trust wasn't about being answered, it was about being heard. Rick noticed it too, though he'd never say it out loud. One night, Morty fell asleep in the living room with Snuffles curled against his side. Rick passed by, paused, and watched them in the quiet glow of the lamp. Morty's hand rested gently over Snuffles' fur, and both were breathing in perfect rhythm. Rick muttered almost to himself, "That's not nothing." He lingered longer than he meant to before shuffling away, flask untouched. In the days that followed, Morty and Snuffles grew inseparable. When Morty was restless, Snuffles would press close until he calmed. When Morty was happy, Snuffles wagged with him, tail tapping against the floor like a drumbeat of joy. Their bond wasn't about words, it was about presence. Morty began to see the world differently through this bond. He noticed kindnesses he might have overlooked before, the way a teacher softened her voice for a nervous student, the way a neighbor left food outside for strays, the way Rick, even with all his chaos, sometimes looked at Morty with a protectiveness he tried to hide. The collar still glowed faintly at night, resting on the workbench in Rick's garage. Morty sometimes swore it pulsed brighter when Snuffles was near, as if acknowledging the bond they shared. Rick called it coincidence, but Morty wasn't so sure. One night, Morty dreamed again. This time, he and Snuffles stood together in the glowing meadow. 1,000 dogs circled them, tails wagging in silence. Morty felt no fear, no doubt, only a deep sense of belonging. When he woke, Snuffles was still at his side, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in peace. Morty whispered, "You're not just my dog. You're my friend. My family." Snuffles stirred, pressing closer, as if to say he already knew. And in that moment, Morty understood something Rick never could quite put into words. That the greatest power wasn't invention, or intelligence or control, it was trust. Trust that grew out of quiet presence, of gentle bonds formed in silence. It was the kind of bond that could change the world, one heartbeat at a time. Midnight was Rick's hour. When the world grew quiet, when even the stars seemed to exhale, that was when he was most alive and most restless. Morty, Summer, Beth, they all slept. Even Snuffles curled on the rug with a steady rhythm of dreams. But Rick paced in the garage, the faint blue light of his tools casting shadows across the walls. The collar lay before him, its glow gentle and steady. Rick stared at it the way a man might stare at an old photograph, with defiance, with longing, with something he didn't want to name. He muttered to himself, as he often did, just a neural amplifier, maybe linked to bioresonance fields of nothing special. His voice trailed off. Even he didn't believe it anymore. For once, the silence pressed against him heavier than usual. He sat down, flask in hand, but didn't drink. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring into that faint light. His reflection blinked back at him, tired and older than he wanted to admit. A sound broke the stillness, soft paws against the floor. Snuffles padded in, tail low, ears twitching. Rick froze as if caught in a crime. "You again?" Rick whispered. "What, couldn't sleep? Or are you here to tell me the secrets of the universe too?" Snuffles tilted his head, then sat down, across from him. No bark, no movement, just a steady gaze. Rick laughed dryly. "Huh, Morty thinks you're his best friend. He's not wrong. You listen better than most people do." "Better than me, that's for damn sure," he sighed, rubbing at his face. The words spilled before he could stop them. "You know, Snuffles, I used to think intelligence was the crown jewel, that knowing more meant winning. But every answer I've ever found just made me lonelier." "And his voice cracked, softer than he expected. "You don't need answers, you just stay." The dog blinked slowly, as if affirming. Rick looked away quickly, muttering, "Pathetic. Talking to a dog. What the hell's wrong with me?" Yet he didn't move. He let the silence linger. Minutes passed, then an hour. Rick didn't drink. He didn't build. He just sat there, the collar glowing softly between them, Snuffles breathing calmly at his side. For once, Rick allowed the quiet to exist without trying to break it. Morty stirred upstairs in his sleep, dreaming of the meadow again. And though Rick never saw it, in the dream, Morty walked through glowing grass, and Rick was there too, sitting. In the distance, head bent low, finally resting. Back in the garage, Rick whispered into the dark, a confession meant for no one. Maybe you mutts know something I don't. Maybe you always have." Snuffles shifted closer, resting his head against Rick's boot. Rick didn't move. He just closed his eyes for a moment, and though he would never admit it, he felt the closest thing to peace he had in years. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the genius, beneath the arrogance, Rick Sanchez smiled. It didn't happen like revolutions usually do. There were no banners, no shouting in the streets, no broken glass or sudden violence. The change came as softly as falling snow, unnoticed until the ground was already blanketed. At first, people thought it was coincidence. A dog leading an elderly man across a busy intersection, another blocking a child from stepping into traffic, strays showing up at hospital doors, curling up beside patients whose families could not be there. These weren't tricks, no training, no human instruction. It was as if the dogs simply knew. Morty noticed the shift everywhere. Walking home from school, he saw two dogs sitting patiently at a corner, guiding pedestrians across when the light changed. In the park, packs gathered around lonely people sitting on benches, their silent company enough to draw tears of relief. Rick, of course, scoffed. "It's pack mentality, Morty. They're herd animals, driven by instinct. Don't romanticize." "Kurt?" But Morty could see the way Rick's eyes lingered, could hear the hesitation in his tone. For once, Rick didn't have all the answers. The strangest part was how naturally humans accepted it. No one panicked, no one resisted. They simply adjusted, as if their hearts had been waiting all along. Buses slowed when a dog stood at the curb. Doctors welcomed them into rooms. Teachers let them sit at the back of classrooms, tails wagging in quiet approval. It was leadership without demand, authority without force. The world didn't bow down to dogs. It leaned toward them, gently, willingly. One evening, Morty walked with Snuffles down the street. The air smelled of rain, and the streetlights glowed like halos. Ahead, a crowd had gathered. A group of dogs sat in a loose circle around a crying teenager. They didn't move, didn't bark, just stayed until the boy's sobs quieted, until his breathing matched their calm rhythm. Then slowly he stood, wiped his face and walked home. The dogs scattered, their work done. Morty felt something stir deep in his chest. "They don't need power," he whispered. "They just care." Rick, standing behind him, muttered, "Care doesn't run a world, Morty." But his voice faltered at the edges. For the first time in history, cities moved to the rhythm of pause, and instead of fear, people felt safer. Instead of chaos, there was calm. It was the first takeover in history that didn't feel like a loss. It felt like remembering something humanity had once known and forgotten, that sometimes the gentlest guides are the truest ones. That night, Morty dreamed again of the glowing meadow. This time, the meadow stretched endlessly, and people walked hand in hand with dogs. No words exchanged, no commands given. Just trust, just quiet companionship beneath the stars. When Morty woke, Snuffles was watching him, eyes soft, tail tapping faintly against the floor. Morty smiled, reaching out to rest his hand on the dog's head. Somehow he already knew the world was changing, and it wasn't war or science that was leading the way. It was loyalty. It was kindness. It was the takeover without violence. That night, Morty slipped into sleep as though the world itself had been waiting to carry him. The moment his eyes closed, the familiar meadow unfolded, wide and endless, bathed in silver-blue light. The grass shimmered like starlight woven into earth, each blade glowing faintly with its own pulse. Morty took a step, and the ground was soft, welcoming. No sound of footsteps, only the hush of breathing. Ahead, dogs were already there, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered across the meadow like constellations come to rest upon the earth. Their eyes glowed gently, not sharp or frightening, but warm, like lanterns on a foggy night. Snuffles was beside him, though Morty didn't remember calling for him. The little dog's fur glowed faintly under the dreamlight. Morty knelt and buried his face against him, and for a moment all the worries of the waking world melted away. No school, no awkwardness, no Rick's sarcastic bite, just this, just trust. The dogs began to move together, not rushing, not chasing, but flowing like water across the meadow. Morty followed, Snuffles padding quietly at his side. As they walked, Morty noticed children playing in the distance, their laughter soft like bells carried by wind. The children weren't afraid. They weren't alone. A dog stood with each one, watching, guiding, listening. Morty whispered, though no one seemed to demand sound here. This is what it's supposed to feel like, the meadow answered, not with words, but with stillness. A stillness so deep it echoed in his chest, soothing him the way lullabies once had when he was small. He realized the meadow wasn't just a dream. It was a memory, not his own, but something older, something carried in every heartbeat that longed for safety. At the center of the meadow, Morty saw Rick. Not as he was in the garage, grumbling and half-drunk, but sitting quietly, legs crossed, head tilted back toward the stars. His eyes were closed, and for once his face was at peace. Dogs surrounded him, but not in worship, in companionship, as if even Rick Sanchez, restless genius of the multiverse, deserved to rest here too. Morty's throat tightened. He wanted to call out, but the dream seemed to tell him not to. This wasn't about words, it was about presence. So Morty simply stood, watching, letting the image of Rick at peace settle into his heart like a secret gift. The stars above bent low, as though they were listening too. Morty felt it. The meadow wasn't only for him, it was for everyone who needed it. A space where loyalty and love stitched the world back together. A space where no one had to be afraid. When Morty finally lay down in the glowing grass, Snuffles curled at his side. He felt the earth itself breathe with him. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the dogs around him. A lullaby of fur and light, and as sleep deepened into sleep, Morty thought he heard something. Not words, but something close. A whisper carried through the glowing blades. You are safe. You are seen. You belong. When morning came, Morty awoke. With damp eyes and a calm smile, Snuffles was there, real and warm, tail tapping faintly against the bed. Morty stroked his fur and whispered, I know, buddy, I know, we're part of something bigger. And for the first time in a long time, Morty felt that the world itself was holding him. It began so quietly that few even noticed. There was no grand announcement, no banners hung from tall buildings, no speeches written for the ears of history. Instead, it happened in the way dusk falls. Slowly, softly, so natural that one only realizes it once the stars are already awake. Dogs began to guide, not in ways that startled or demanded attention, but in ways that made life flow easier. A stranger would find themselves lost on a lonely street, and a dog would appear at the corner, pausing, glancing back, waiting until the human followed. They would be led step by gentle step until they found the path they had forgotten. In hospitals, children too anxious to close their eyes would feel a warm head press against their hands, the soft rhythm of a tail brushing their blankets. Somehow the children slept. Somehow they healed. And in the silence between one day and the next, humans began to notice that they trusted the dogs more than the voices of their own leaders, more than the endless chatter of the screens. Not because dogs demanded it, not because they forced themselves into positions of power, but because trust had always been there, waiting, unspoken. Morty saw it most clearly. Walking home from school, he noticed cars pausing at intersections without horns, because a dog had stepped into the road, waiting with calm certainty. People followed. Not one resisted. The world seemed to understand. These guides were not conquerors. They were guardians. One evening, Morty sat beside Rick in the garage. Tools were scattered everywhere, glass bottles stacked in tired towers, the smell of oil and ozone thick in the air. Rick was quieter than usual. His eyes were distant, as if tracking equations not on paper, but in the patterns of the world itself. "You see it too, right?" Morty asked softly. Rick grunted as if reluctant to admit it. Yeah, I see it." He leaned back in his chair, letting it creak under his weight. "Not exactly the uprising they warned us about, huh?" Morty smiled faintly. "It's different. It's like they're not taking over, they're just taking care." Rick's lips twitched into the smallest of smirks. "Care. Shh. Never thought that'd be the force to beat us." He lifted his flask, but his drink was more thoughtful than bitter this time, and so it was. No war, no speeches, no resistance. Humanity began to lean into the presence of dogs as if it had been the way all along. Like children curling into sleep, they surrendered not out of fear, but out of relief. In the weeks that followed, Morty noticed something in the air. People spoke more softly. Strangers lingered longer at doorways to help one another. The tension of rushing, of constant noise, loosened its grip. It was as if the whole world had exhaled at once. No law declared it. No treaty signed it. Yet it was there as true as the sunrise, a pact. A promise formed not in words but in the spaces between breaths. Humanity would follow, and the dogs would guide, not as rulers, but as companions, as mirrors to the gentler parts of themselves. That night, Morty dreamed again of the meadow. This time there were no whispers of mystery, only the soft certainty of belonging. He walked among the glowing dogs, and for the first time he did not feel like a guest in their world. He felt like family, and when he awoke, he knew the pact was sealed. Not in ink, not in law, but in trust. The kind of trust that needs no explanation, the kind that waits in silence and is answered with silence in return. The sky had always seemed far away to Morty, a painted ceiling above the world, unreachable, untouchable. But lately, when he looked up at night, he could not shake the feeling that the stars were leaning closer. Not falling, not burning, but bending as though the universe itself wanted to listen. It began after the silent pact. Streets grew calmer, voices softer. The rhythm of life no longer rushed, but carried on gentle pause. In that stillness, the stars seemed different. They no longer twinkled with distance. They pulsed slow and steady like heartbeats in the dark. Morty sat outside on the back porch, his dog resting against his knee. He traced the patterns in the sky, remembering the nights when Rick had dragged him through galaxies, showing him planets like trinkets. Back then, space had been loud, chaotic, endless. But now, it was tender. Even the vastness felt close, as if the stars bent lower not to dazzle but to comfort. "You know, Morty," Rick muttered one evening, joining him with a faint smell of metal and whiskey. People always think stars are far away, but distance is just perception. You look long enough and you realize maybe they're looking back. Morty turned his head, startled by the softness in Rick's voice. His grandfather rarely let words slip like that. For once Rick didn't smirk, didn't cover the moment with sarcasm. He just watched the sky, his eyes reflecting pinpricks of silver. It was strange. Rick, the man who built machines to conquer dimensions, was sitting still, letting silence speak. And in that moment, Morty felt something shift. Maybe even Rick was learning to listen. Nights became slower, dreamlike. Morty dreamed of stars bending down like branches heavy with fruit. He reached not to pluck them, but to rest his hand against their glow. They hummed, low and soothing, like lullabies carried on wind. People, too, noticed the change. Neighbors, who had once rushed indoors, now lingered outside at twilight, their dogs sitting patiently at their sides. They whispered about how the sky felt different, though none could say why. Children pointed upward, certain that the stars were leaning close to hear their secrets. Morty wondered if the pact with dogs had opened something greater, a doorway not just between humans and animals, but between the earth and the heavens. Perhaps the universe rewarded gentleness with nearness. Perhaps the stars leaned closer because they finally trusted what they saw below. Rick, though he never admitted it, seemed lighter. Morty caught him once, quietly sketching constellations instead of formulas, not mapping their coordinates but tracing their shapes, the way a child might doodle, not a scientist. For Morty, the stars became something more than light. They became mirrors. When he felt lost, they reminded him that even the farthest things could reach back, if only with quiet presence. And when he lay in bed, drifting to sleep, the stars bent close in his dreams, whispering not in words but in warmth. Rest, rest, rest. The world itself seemed wrapped in a softer glow. Lamps flickered less harshly. Windows caught the moonlight, like gentle eyes. Even Rick's garage, usually a chaos of sparks and shadows, seemed less heavy, as if some cosmic light had found its way inside. And Morty realized the universe was not watching to judge or measure. It was watching the way one watches a sleeping child, protective, patient, full of quiet awe. So the nights passed, and the stars leaned closer still. And though no one ever agreed on why, no one feared it. They welcomed it, the way one welcomes, a blanket in the cold. Morty, nestled in the quiet with his dog, whispered thank you to the sky. He didn't expect an answer, but in the hush of the night he felt heard. Rick was not known for smiles, his mouth usually curled in smirks, bitter or sharp, the kind that hid behind jokes and science and bottles. But lately, Morty noticed something. Different, fleeting, almost secret. A smile not meant for the world, not even for himself, but for the quiet. It happened one night, when the house was still. Morty wandered into the garage to find his grandfather hunched over the workbench, light spilling across tools and scattered notes. The usual clutter was there, but the atmosphere felt softer, as though even the machines knew to hum more gently. Rick didn't look up. He was soldering something, sparks flickering faintly like fireflies. But then Morty saw it, the corner of his grandfather's mouth lifting, faint but unmistakable, not wide, not boastful, just small still, almost reverent. Rick? You okay? Morty whispered, unsure if he should intrude. Rick blinked, caught, then leaned back with a scoff. What, a guy can't enjoy his own work without being psychoanalyzed by a teenager? But his voice lacked its usual bite. The smile, though hidden, didn't vanish. Morty tilted his head. He'd seen Rick laugh at chaos, grin at danger, sneer at stupidity. But this was different. This smile belonged to peace, a rare visitor, in Rick's restless life. Later that week, Morty noticed it again. Rick sat on the porch, drink in hand, staring at the yard where dogs guided children across the street. His lips curved faintly, a softness in his eyes Morty barely recognized. No gadgets, no explosions, no multiverse collapsing, just the simple sight of loyalty at work. Rick muttered, almost to himself, guess they figured it out, didn't they? A world without leaders, just companions. His smile lingered in the dim light, hidden beneath the shadows of his face. Morty didn't press. He simply sat beside him, the two of them breathing in sync with the quiet rhythm of the night. It struck Morty then. Rick's hidden smile was not weakness, it was surrender. A surrender not to defeat but to gentleness, to the possibility that maybe the universe didn't need fixing all the time. Maybe sometimes it just needed noticing. That night, Morty dreamed of his grandfather smiling in the meadow of stars, dogs curled at their feet, galaxies unfolding like blankets. In the dream, Rick didn't speak, didn't invent, didn't argue. He simply sat there, smiling as though, for once, he belonged. When Morty woke, he carried the image with him like a lantern. He realized that even geniuses, even men burdened by endless thoughts, could find stillness in something as small as trust. And that stillness, when it came, looked like a smile half hidden, born not of brilliance but of peace. And so the world turned quietly, dogs guiding, stars leaning closer. And in the shadows of it all, Rick's hidden smile became a secret the universe itself seemed to keep safe. Trust had never come easily to Morty. The world, shaped by Rick's experiments and chaos, often felt fragile, as though everything could crack at the slightest mistake. He had grown used to clutching tightly, clutching fear, clutching doubt, clutching the belief that if he didn't watch every corner, something terrible would happen. But lately, things were different. The dogs had changed more than streets and skies. They had changed Morty too. It began with small moments. Crossing the road one afternoon, Morty hesitated at the curb. His instincts told him to wait, to second-guess. But a golden retriever padded to his side, looking up with calm certainty. The dog stepped forward, and without thinking, Morty followed. No honking, no rushing, just the quiet order of the world falling into place. For the first time, Morty realized he hadn't checked for himself. He had trusted. That night, lying in bed, he thought about it. Trust wasn't about proof or guarantees. Trust was about letting go of control, allowing something else, something kind, to guide you. It was the opposite of what Rick taught him. Rick trusted nothing, no one. But Morty felt something stirring. He tested it in little ways. When his dog nudged his hand toward the porch, Morty followed, not asking why. When his mother told him things would be okay, he didn't argue. He let her words rest in his chest like a soft blanket. Even with Rick in the garage thick with silence, Morty began to listen differently. Not to the science or sarcasm, but to the pauses, the places where truth hid. One evening, Rick caught him staring at the stars with his dog's head resting in his lap. "You think the world's suddenly trustworthy, huh, Morty?" Rick asked, half mocking. Morty hesitated, then said softly, "I think maybe trust isn't about the world being safe. Maybe it's about deciding to believe anyway." Rick grunted, unsatisfied with the simplicity, but Morty didn't need Rick's approval this time. He felt the truth in his own chest, steady as a heartbeat. Dreams deepened with this new understanding. Morty dreamed of fields where he walked blindfolded, guided only by the touch of a paw or the brush of a star against his shoulder. And in those dreams, he never stumbled. He moved forward step by step, learning that falling wasn't failure. It was simply another way of being carried. The days that followed felt lighter. He trusted his friends to laugh with him, not at him. He trusted his dog to sit beside him in silence, needing no explanation. He even trusted Rick, just a little, to care in ways he didn't always show. And as Morty let go, the world responded. Colors seemed softer, nights felt safer. Even the silence between conversations became warm instead of heavy. He learned that trust wasn't blind. It was a choice, a gift. And when given freely, it turned the ordinary into something sacred. Morty didn't announce this change. He didn't need to. It lived in the way he walked, in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the way he no longer clutched everything so tightly. And somewhere deep inside, he realized that trusting wasn't weakness. It was courage, the quiet kind, the kind that let him rest. It didn't look like a crown, not in the way kings and emperors wore them. There were no jewels, no heavy bands of gold. Instead, it appeared one quiet morning in the park, where dogs and humans gathered without plan, drawn by some unspoken pull. The grass still held the silver of dew, and the air was filled with the soft rhythm of paws against earth. Children laughed sleepily, leaning against their dogs as though they were pillows brought to life. Adults stood nearby, calm, silent, watching. At the center, an old shepherd dog sat with dignity. His muzzle was grey, his eyes deep with years of patience. Around him, younger dogs circled, not in chaos but in reverence, and then, one by one, people stepped forward, offering not gifts of riches, but gestures of trust. A child draped a simple ribbon across his neck. An elderly woman placed a hand upon his head, whispering thanks. Someone laid down a blanket, woven by human hands, so he could rest more softly. It was no ceremony, no coronation. And yet, Morty felt it in his chest, the weight of a moment that belonged to history, even if no book would ever record it. This was the crown of loyalty, invisible but shining, built not from metal but from the unbreakable thread between hearts. Rick stood in the distance, arms crossed, pretending disinterest. But Morty noticed his eyes lingering, noticed the faint curve of his lips when the old shepherd lowered his head in humble acceptance. This is different, Rick," Morty whispered. "It's not power, it's love, right?" Rick gave a low grunt. "Love's just a word, Morty. What you're seeing, that's continuity. That's what happens when a species figures out how to stick with each other." He paused, voice quieter. "Guess it doesn't need math to matter." The shepherd dog closed his eyes, resting at last, and the meadow seemed to glow. Sunlight fell not harsh but tender, as though the sky itself approved. People and dogs sat together in silence, and in that silence, Morty felt something shift inside him. It wasn't about crowns or titles. It wasn't about who led and who followed. It was about the bond itself, the trust that had carried through countless nights, countless generations. A crown not of gold, but of belonging. That night, Morty dreamed again of the meadow of stars, but this time he saw the old shepherd sitting beneath the constellations, the ribbon still draped across his neck. The stars bent lower, as though bowing in respect. And Morty understood. Loyalty was its own kind of royalty. Not loud, not showy, just eternal. When he woke, he carried the dream with him like a secret promise tucked into his pocket. He knew the world would forget ceremonies and speeches, but it would never forget the crown of loyalty, because it lived quietly in every bond between a human and their dog. And that, Morty realized, was enough. Morty had grown taller, his voice carrying more weight now. But sometimes, in the quiet of evening, he still felt like the small boy who once curled against his dog, listening to the steady rhythm of breath. Those early nights returned to him like echoes, soft, persistent, impossible to silence. He remembered lying on his bedroom floor with a blanket pulled around him, the glow of the nightlight casting shapes on the wall. His dog had been there, then eyes half closed, tail brushing against the floor with slow reassurance. Every sound outside, every creak of the house, every whisper of wind, had felt less frightening because of that presence. Now, as the world shifted into something new, Morty realized those moments had prepared him. The trust, the comfort, the safety of companionship. It had always been the foundation. What the world was discovering now, Morty had already known in childhood. One evening, Morty walked with Rick down a quiet street. Dogs padded ahead, guiding people across intersections with calm authority. Morty paused, watching a child stumble, only to be steadied by a shepherd's gentle nudge. The scene struck him like déjà vu. He saw himself in that child, saw his younger self leaning on comfort he couldn't explain but always trusted. "Rick," Morty said softly, "do you ever think about when you were little? Like if you had moments that stuck with you, even if they seemed small at the time?" Rick grunted, hands deep in his coat pockets. "Childhood's overrated, Morty. People romanticize it. Truth is, it's just survival, waiting until you're old enough to mess things up yourself." Morty frowned but didn't press. He knew Rick's childhood had its own shadows, and yet, even in Rick's silence, Morty felt the echo, because here they were, side by side, both guided by the same quiet presence of loyalty. That night, Morty dreamed again, but it wasn't the vast meadow or bending stars. It was his old bedroom, the soft hum of the nightlight, the feel of a dog's fur beneath his fingertips, a sense of safety so complete it was almost holy. He woke with tears on his cheeks, not from sadness, but from gratitude. Echoes of childhood lingered everywhere after that. In the way dogs leaned against strangers waiting for buses, in the way adults softened their voices when speaking under the moon, in the way even Rick sometimes paused to listen, to breathe, to smile faintly at nothing. Morty realized that childhood was never truly left behind. It lived in echoes, gentle reminders that the comfort we once needed was never lost, only hidden beneath the layers of growing up. And now, as dogs and humans walked together into a new kind of world, those echoes returned, louder, clearer, guiding them like lullabies carried on the wind. Morty whispered to himself, almost as if to the boy he once was. "You were safe then. You're safe now, you always were." And in that moment he believed it. It had been months since the world had quietly shifted, months since dogs began to guide without demanding, to lead without ruling. Humanity had grown calmer, softer, and yet Morty noticed something he hadn't before. Dogs too grew tired. One evening, as twilight brushed the sky with violet, Morty saw a Labrador curl into a circle beneath a bench, her sides rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. People passed, her without fear, without disturbance. They seemed to understand even guardians need sleep. It startled Morty at first. In his mind, the dogs had become eternal figures, always awake, always watching. But now he realized they were like him, like everyone else. They needed moments of surrender. Rick sat beside him, watching a collie doze in the grass, ears twitching in dream. Even the best systems, Morty, they need downtime. You can't run forever. Not even loyalty's infinite. Morty hugged his knees. "I guess I thought they were unstoppable, like they'd never need to rest." Rick chuckled, a low, almost affectionate sound. "That's the point, kid. The rest is part of the work. Without it, nothing lasts." That night, Morty dreamed differently. He didn't see glowing meadows or bending stars. He saw dogs sleeping. In endless circles, scattered across the world like lanterns extinguished only to reignite later. Their dreams shimmered faintly, carrying peace outward, so that even in sleep, they guided. In the dream, Morty walked barefoot among them, careful not to disturb their rest. He felt an overwhelming tenderness, an understanding that protection didn't always mean standing tall. Sometimes it meant curling small, breathing softly, trusting the world to wait. The next morning, the streets were quieter. People walked slower, almost in rhythm with the breathing of the resting dogs. It was as though the entire world had agreed to match their pace, to honor their pause. Morty realized then, true guidance didn't come from endless action. It came from balance. By resting, the dogs were teaching humanity something deeper, that slowing down wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. That evening, Morty sat with his dog on the porch. When the animal's head dropped into his lap, eyes closing, Morty didn't move. He simply stayed still, listening to the rhythm of breath, his hand resting lightly on fur. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The stars leaned closer that night, but even they seemed hushed, as though watching over the world's guardians as they dreamed. And Morty, drifting into his own sleep, understood, when even dogs rest, the universe itself pauses to keep them safe. It had been months since the world had quietly shifted, months since dogs began to guide without demanding, to lead without ruling. Humanity had grown calmer, softer, and yet Morty noticed something he hadn't before. Dogs too grew tired. One evening, as twilight brushed the sky with violet, Morty saw a Labrador curl into a circle beneath a bench, her sides rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. People passed her without fear, without disturbance. They seemed to understand even guardians need sleep. It startled Morty at first. In his mind, the dogs had become eternal figures, always awake, always watching. But now he realized they were like him, like everyone else. They needed moments of surrender. Rick sat beside him, watching a collie doze in the grass, ears twitching in dream. Even the best systems, Morty, they need downtime. You can't run forever. Not even loyalty's infinite. Morty hugged his knees. I guess I thought they were unstoppable, like they'd never need to rest. Rick chuckled, a low, almost affectionate sound. That's the point, kid. The rest is part of the work. Without it, nothing lasts. That night, Morty dreamed differently. He didn't see glowing meadows or bending stars. He saw dogs sleeping. In endless circles, scattered across the world like lanterns extinguished only to reignite later. Their dreams shimmered faintly, carrying peace outward, so that even in sleep, they guided. In the dream, Morty walked barefoot among them, careful not to disturb their rest. He felt an overwhelming tenderness, an understanding that protection didn't always mean standing tall. Sometimes it meant curling small, breathing softly, trusting the world to wait. The next morning, the streets were quieter. People walked slower, almost in rhythm with the breathing of the resting dogs. It was as though the entire world had agreed to match their pace, to honor their pause. Morty realized then, true guidance didn't come from endless action. It came from balance. By resting, the dogs were teaching humanity something deeper, that slowing down wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. That evening, Morty sat with his dog on the porch. When the animal's head dropped into his lap, eyes closing, Morty didn't move. He simply stayed still, listening to the rhythm of breath, his hand resting lightly on fur. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The stars leaned closer that night, but even they seemed hushed, as though watching over the world's guardians as they dreamed. And Morty, drifting into his own sleep, understood. When even dogs rest, the universe itself pauses to keep them safe. The night stretched out like a velvet ribbon, quiet and endless, as though time itself had slowed its pace for the sake of tenderness. Morty and Rick walked side by side along a narrow path, the river keeping them company with its steady hush. Behind them, families and dogs drifted together, each pair moving as though guided by the same silent rhythm. It wasn't a march, not a parade, just a walk, soft and unhurried, where every step felt like a heartbeat. The dogs led the way, not with leashes or commands, but with a calm certainty that seemed older than language, their paws pressed into the soil like gentle stamps, each print glowing faintly in the moonlight as if the earth itself wanted to remember them. Morty watched in awe, his chest swelling with a warmth that had no name. "Rick," he whispered, "it feels like they're guiding us somewhere." Rick gave a small grunt, though his eyes softened as they caught the shimmer of paw prints ahead. "Not somewhere new, Morty. Somewhere we've always been heading. We just didn't know it until now." Morty looked around. He saw children resting their hands on dogs' backs, old men leaning gently on loyal companions, strangers, smiling at one another without needing words. It was as if the world had slipped into harmony, every soul bound together by the quiet trust of these four-legged guardians. The path curved, opening into a wide clearing. The river spread out into a silver pool, reflecting the stars so perfectly that Morty felt he was standing between two skies, one above, one beneath. The dogs stopped at the edge of the water. Some sat, some curled up, their eyes half closed with peace. Morty and Rick stood at the shore, their reflections rippling beside them. Morty noticed how his shadow stretched long, joined by the outline of his dog, their forms touching like an unspoken promise. "Look at that," Morty said softly. "It's like we're all connected." Rick shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "Morty, connection was always there. We just spend most of our lives too distracted to notice. Tonight the noise is gone, that's why you see it." Morty's heart swelled. He thought about the first time he had fallen asleep with his dog at his side, how safe he'd felt. And, now walking together by this quiet river, it felt like that same safety had grown to cover the whole world. Behind them, voices hushed. Families sat at the banks. Some closed their eyes, leaning into the steady warmth of their companions. Others held hands, their silence saying everything words could not. Rick finally sat down too, his back hunched but his expression unusually calm. Morty followed, leaning close. Together, they watched the reflections in the water. "You know, Morty," Rick murmured, "we chase a lot in this life, knowledge, power, approval, but tonight nobody's chasing anything. They're just walking. That's enough." Morty nodded. "It feels like the whole world is exhaling." Rick smirked faintly, but there was no bite in it. "Yeah, maybe it is." A breeze moved over the clearing, ruffling hair and fur, alike. The stars shimmered brighter, leaning close as if to listen. The river's song deepened, carrying whispers only the heart could hear. The final walk wasn't an ending, Morty realized. It was a remembering. A way for humans and dogs alike to remind each other of the path they'd always shared. Step by step, breath by breath, trust leading the way. And so they sat by the water's edge until the night folded gently around them like a blanket. Rick, Morty, their dog, and countless others, all part of one quiet procession toward peace. No destination, no conclusion, just the walk itself, shining softly beneath the stars. The moon hung low, silver and tender, casting gentle light over the quiet streets. The final walk had ended, but not all journeys had. Some dogs paused at corners, noses lifting to scents only they could follow. Some children lingered, reluctant to let go of the warmth pressed against them. And in these pauses, Morty saw the beauty of soft goodbyes. He knelt beside his dog, feeling the familiar weight of trust in its gaze. The animal shifted, head resting in his lap one last time, before moving toward another path, another soul in need. Morty's heart ached softly, but he knew these departures were never abrupt. They were gentle, measured, guided by the rhythm of care itself. Rick appeared beside him, leaning on the fence, watching quietly. "It's strange," he murmured. Voice lower than the wind. "Even endings feel easy now. Not because they're less important, but because they're honest." Morty nodded, stroking the fur of his dog before letting it go. The animal padded forward, tail high but relaxed, and Morty whispered, "Take care. Keep them safe." All around them, humans mirrored the same quiet farewell. Parents hugged children a little. Longer. Friends exchanged soft smiles instead of hurried words. Even the air seemed to pause, holding its breath for just a moment, honoring each goodbye. Morty noticed a small pack of dogs trotting down a distant street, guiding a wandering child home. The movement was seamless, unhurried like the closing of a book after a story well told, and he realized that leaving, when done with care, was not loss. It was part of the cycle of trust and love that had grown in the world. Rick's hand rested lightly on Morty's shoulder. "You see, Morty, you don't always have to hold on. Sometimes letting go is the most powerful thing you can do." Morty swallowed the lump in his throat, feeling the truth of it seep into his chest. "I think I understand now," he whispered. "Goodbyes, they can be gentle. They can leave room for new beginnings." The river, still and reflective, mirrored the night sky. Stars shimmered faintly in its surface, as though acknowledging the quiet transitions around them. Each soft goodbye, Morty realized, was like a ripple in the water, small, tender, but carrying meaning far beyond what the eye could see. The dogs' journeys continued into the night. Morty's own companion lingered a moment longer, as if understanding his thoughts, then turned toward the shadows of the next street, ready to guide another. Morty let out a quiet breath, feeling both the ache of parting and the warmth of trust. That remained. Rick finally spoke, voice barely above the rustle of leaves. "Morty, this is how life works. We walk together, we share what we can, and when it's time we step aside. Nobody really leaves completely. They're always with you, in the quiet moments, in the soft echoes, in the trust that keeps going." Morty looked up at the sky, at the stars bending slightly closer as if to listen. "I'll remember," he said softly. "Every soft goodbye, every paw print, every quiet moment." Rick gave a faint approving hum. "Good, that's all that matters." And as they watched, the world seemed to exhale again. Dogs disappeared down moonlit streets, children yawned and drifted into slumber, and the night embraced every gentle departure with a tender hush. Soft goodbyes weren't endings. They were gifts, leaving space for hope, trust, and the next step forward. Morty leaned back, closing his eyes, feeling the world fold into peace around him. He realized then that these small, quiet moments, these soft goodbyes, were the true threads that held life together. And he felt them in his chest, glowing faintly, warm, eternal. Rick had always believed he mattered to the universe, that every calculation, every portal, every invention marked his presence among the stars. But tonight, as he walked alone along a quiet stretch of riverbank, he felt something new, something humbling. The world had changed. Dogs guided, humans followed, and stars leaned close to the earth, bending like gentle eyes. And yet, the universe didn't acknowledge him. Not with fireworks, not with applause, not even a whisper. It had in a way forgotten Rick. For a long moment he let the feeling settle. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when someone finally stops fighting to be seen and simply allows themselves to be. Morty, walking a few steps behind, noticed the shift. "Rick?" he said softly. Rick didn't answer right away. He just looked at the moon's reflection in the river, its silver light stretching across ripples like a path he could no longer follow. "Morty," he said finally, voice low. Maybe the universe doesn't need me as much as I thought. Maybe it's bigger than my understanding, bigger than my meddling, and maybe that's okay." Morty hesitated. "You're not mad?" Rick shook his head, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Why would I be? I used to think my worth was measured by knowledge, by invention, by control. But look at the world now. Life goes on. It thrives. It heals. Without me, constantly poking at it." Morty felt a quiet awe in his chest. Rick, the man who had once carried the weight of entire dimensions on his shoulders, was now learning a different kind of humility, the surrender of presence over power. He knelt beside a dog that had wandered close, its head resting gently on his knee. The animal looked up at him with calm eyes, unafraid, as though it understood every complex thought swirling in his mind and found them unnecessary. Rick chuckled softly. Guess I can step back and still exist, without interference, without chaos, just being." The stars above seemed to shimmer more brightly, though not for him, at least not directly. They leaned closer anyway, as if honoring the quiet patience of the world below. Rick realized then that sometimes being forgotten wasn't a curse. Sometimes it was a gift, a chance to observe, to feel, to finally rest without expectation. Morty joined him, leaning against his grandfather's side. Together they watched families walk home with dogs by their sides, the moonlight weaving silver threads through the night. Rick felt something soft stir in his chest. Not pride, not ownership. Just wonder. "I don't have to control everything," Rick whispered. "I don't have to fix it all. Maybe I just have to notice. Maybe that's enough." Morty smiled faintly. "You've noticed, Rick. That counts." Rick looked at his grandson, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel entirely present, small, human, and part of something greater than himself. The universe may have forgotten him, but the world below, the gentle pulse of life and loyalty, remembered everything that mattered. And as the river murmured its lullaby, the stars leaned even closer, bending low to watch. Rick let out a deep breath, finally free from the weight of expectation. He didn't need to be remembered by galaxies. He was here. He was still. He was enough. The night carried him softly, and Morty's hand found his. In the quiet reflection of the water, of the stars, of the sleeping dogs, Rick felt peace, simple, profound, and long overdue. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt as soft as a blanket, wrapping the world in gentle warmth. Morty sat on the riverbank, his dog nestled against his side, the moon casting silver threads across the water. He thought about everything he had seen, everything he had felt. The loyalty of the dogs, the quiet power of trust, and the rare glimpses of Rick's hidden heart. He felt a sense of responsibility settle over him, but not the heavy, panicked kind he had known before. This was lighter, steady, a promise he could keep. "I won't forget," Morty whispered to himself, voice barely louder than the rustle of leaves. I'll carry it forward. Every paw print, every quiet act of care, every small moment of trust." The dog lifted its head, looking at him with understanding eyes, as if to say, "I know you will." Morty's mind wandered through memories. Nights, when he had curled up beside his dog, the comfort that had felt like magic. Times when he had been unsure, afraid, or overwhelmed. And now, standing at the threshold of a world softened by loyalty, he realized that he had learned something no calculation or gadget could teach. Courage wasn't about grand gestures. It was about remaining gentle in the face of uncertainty. It was about keeping trust alive, even when others might forget. He closed his eyes, imagining the future. He saw children walking with dogs by their sides, strangers smiling at each other, adults learning to pause and listen. He saw himself, older, wiser, carrying forward the quiet lessons of compassion and empathy that the dogs had shown him. Rick, sitting a few paces away, sipped his drink and glanced toward Morty. The faint curve of his mouth hinted at understanding. He didn't say a word, but Morty knew his grandfather trusted him too. Morty's promise wasn't made aloud to the world. It was a vow carried quietly in his heart. A thread woven through dreams and actions, a commitment to honor the gentle wisdom he had received. He felt the stars above lean closer, as if acknowledging the oath. The river reflected them softly, the water rippling with a rhythm that matched the beating of his chest. Every small act mattered, Morty realized. Every quiet choice of kindness, every moment of patience, every time he let love and trust guide him. These were the things that built a world worth holding on to. The dog nudged him gently, and Morty smiled, realizing that promises were easiest kept when shared. And in that soft moonlit silence, he promised not just to remember but to live in alignment with what he had learned. He whispered again, softer this time, "I'll do my best. Always. For them, for us, for everyone who needs to believe in something gentle and true." The night deepened, embracing him with warmth. Morty's chest felt light, full of hope, and yet grounded in the kind of reality only trust can bring. He leaned back against the earth, letting it hold him, letting the river sing beneath the stars. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked softly, a reminder that the world would continue, guided by the quiet guardians who needed no recognition. Morty closed his eyes, carrying the promise forward into the stillness, into the dreams, into the gentle unfolding of tomorrow. And in that promise, the world felt whole, even in its smallest moments. The night had settled into a deep, velvet calm, stretching across the sky and the sleeping earth like a blanket stitched with silver threads. Every street, every meadow, every quiet riverbank seemed to exhale in unison, carrying with it the soft rhythms of rest and peace. Morty lay beneath a tree, his dog curled gently at his side, the gentle rise and fall of its chest syncing with his own heartbeat. Somewhere just beyond the reach of the moon's glow, a dog waited. Not for a command, not for reward, not for anything but the continuation of something timeless. The world had changed, shaped by countless acts of trust, care, and quiet loyalty. And yet, even in this serene world, the vigilance of guardians endured, not out of duty, but out of love. Morty's eyes wandered across the horizon to the glimmer of lights, from distant homes to the faint silhouettes of dogs patrolling in gentle arcs, guiding the unaware, comforting the lonely. He realized with a soft awe that the presence of a dog waiting wasn't a call to action. It was a promise. Their promise that someone somewhere would always watch over the world with gentle patience. Rick, sitting a short distance away, raised his flask briefly in silent acknowledgement of the peaceful scene. Even he, who had spent so much of his life chasing brilliance, explosions, and answers, seemed to soften under the weight of the quiet night. Morty could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the faint curve of his lips, as he watched dogs lie curled on porches, waiting. Morty leaned closer to his dog, feeling the warmth of fur against his arm. "We'll be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't speaking just to the animal beside him. He was speaking to the world, to the quiet guardians, to Rick, and to himself. "We'll be okay because someone's always here, even when we can't see them." In his mind, Morty replayed the journey. The silent paw prints of childhood, the glowing collars, the first moment of trust, the crown of loyalty, the lessons of letting go, and the gentle goodbyes. It all converged in this single night of calm, each memory a thread weaving the tapestry of the world's quiet heartbeat. And then, in the stillness, he understood something deeper. The world may forget names, faces, or deeds, but it could never forget the essence of guardianship. Somewhere a dog still waits, waiting to comfort, waiting to guide, waiting to remind humanity of the beauty of patience, trust, and unconditional love. Morty's eyes grew heavy, but he didn't fight it. The soft chorus of night, the river's whisper, the wind through leaves, the faint hum of distant dogs, lulled him toward sleep. He felt the peace not just in his body but in his soul. The promise he had made, the lessons he had learned, the quiet watchfulness surrounding him, it was all enough. Rick's voice, unusually soft, broke through the whispering night. Thanks for being here, Morty. For seeing it. For feeling it. Even I can't argue with this kind of quiet. Morty smiled in the darkness, letting sleep take him, and in his dreams he wandered through meadows bathed in moonlight. Dogs ran freely, their collars glowing faintly, guiding those who needed comfort, waiting patiently, eternally. He felt their trust, their loyalty, and their love, and it filled him with a warmth that didn't fade. And somewhere, beyond the reach of the visible world, a dog still waits. Waiting for the next heart to lean on, the next soul to trust, the next quiet step toward peace. The world may move on, humans may forget, but the guardians endure, silent, patient, and infinitely tender. Morty exhaled, the night embracing him, the stars bending low, the river singing softly, the dog at his side breathing a gentle rhythm of assurance. He drifted fully into sleep, carrying the lessons, the memories, and the quiet heartbeat of the world with him. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.